So I normally talk about development, but I'm actually going to start by talking about innovation um, uh, with some lessons from COVID and COVID vaccines, because when I was in the UK, I was brought in, as actually many other development people were brought in, to help on thinking about how to incentivize the innovation and scale up of COVID vaccines. Because the people who knew about infectious diseases and vaccines were all development people. It was quite funny, suddenly we were at the center of kind of domestic policy, but also because I think it has implications and some lessons for how we think about financing innovation. And then I'm going to turn to climate and particularly innovation, how do we finance and incentivize innovation for climate? Okay, so COVID-19 vaccines are a very good example of the incredible value of innovation. And we did some work during during the early months of COVID, showing just how much the world needed COVID vaccines, and therefore how much we ought to be putting into the financing of COVID vaccines. So, at that point, in early 2021, we were losing about 500 billion in GDP per month in the world because of COVID, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of people who were losing their lives because of COVID. If you add the health and the GDP costs, you get to about $1 trillion a month. And what that means is accelerating widespread vaccination of a COVID vaccine was worth about $1 trillion a month. Simply accelerating it by a month was worth $1 trillion. But as you will see, we were putting nothing like that into the investment into COVID vaccines. Now, again, we did these calculations that said, if you look at there were about 3 billion. There's about capacity to produce 3 billion doses in 2021, and we estimated that was worth about 5,800 per course. So the ability to produce a course of vaccines, COVID vaccines in 2021 was worth nearly $6,000 per course. As you'll see, the cost, what companies were actually being paid was something between $6 and $40. So absolutely huge gap between those two numbers. And another way of thinking about it is Operation Warp Speed, which the US was the US program to kind of accelerate COVID vaccines. They spent about 13 billion, which would have paid for itself if it had accelerated COVID vaccines by 12 hours. Right? So that gives you a sense of the mismatch between the value of innovation and what we actually spend on it. Right? People think that Warp Speed was a huge investment, and it was. It was nothing compared to the value. I talked about COVID vaccines, but let's take another example of the benefits of innovation. This is, just looking at our production of cereals in agriculture, and this huge increase, despite the fact that we are not using any more land for production of food. We've seen massive increases in production, which has stopped us basically having starvation, because otherwise we would have been in a really, a bad Malthusian trap. And that came from a huge investment, a large investment, a very productive investment in innovation in agriculture, the Green Revolution, which not only produced more food, it then led to falling food prices, which the poor spend a higher proportion of their income on food. So even though the technologies first went to richer farmers, it actually was incredibly important in the big declines in poverty that we've seen around the world. So innovation is incredibly important for social benefit, but as I hinted already, the social value is much higher than the private value, right? The people who invest in innovation get only a fraction of the return to that innovation. So as I said, COVID vaccines, you're getting, a worth kind of 6,000 a course, and we're paying $6 to $40. Now, did that matter? Yes. When we were working on trying to get more production of vaccines, the conventional wisdom was you can't hurry this. Like, there's only a limited amount of capacity of vaccines around. It takes you, it takes 9 months to build a bioreactor, which is what you use to cook the vaccines. You can't speed that up. We're running out of glass vials. Like, there's nothing you can do. This is again and again and again and again, this is what the experts told you. At which point we would say, if we gave you $1 billion, could you get a bioreactor a bit faster? Could you get, what is a bioreactor? Oh, well, it's a, thing. It's like a big thing of metal. It's like a big cooking pot. I'm like, seriously? If you had $1 billion, could you get a small bioreactor? Of course we could. Absolutely, universally, of course we could. What people meant by you can't speed this up is you can't speed it up at the same price, right? But we were completely fine. Like, it was worth $1 billion. Like, these supply constraints that we were hitting were worth $1 billion, but that just wasn't anywhere in the picture. And that's what things like the Warp Speed were saying. We're just going to throw money, and you could actually solve a bunch of these things. And vaccines scaled up much faster than anyone thought was possible, even though the prices stayed very low. So it mattered. It mattered, and people died because we didn't respond well enough. Note, I am not saying, so these problems are caused by, reflect the fact that the social value doesn't reflect, the private value doesn't reflect the social value. That does not mean I am saying we should have charged thousands of dollars per vaccine and only given it to the people who could afford it. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying we need to reward innovation in a way that reflects the social benefit. In other words, the government needs to do something about covering that gap, right? And again, I've given the example of COVID, but you can look across innovation across multiple sectors, and you see these very, very high wedges between the social return to innovation and the private return. So, what worked on COVID vaccines? Well, one of the market problems was that there was a low expected probability of any one vaccine to work. It turned out that most of them worked, but like all the historical evidence might not have been the case. So, what's the policy response to that is you need to invest in invested in multiple vaccines. We had no idea whether mRNA vaccines were going to work. It's the first time they were done. We could not put all our eggs in that basket. Fortunately, people understood that. Social returns are much bigger than private returns. You need government subsidy. What's the best way to structure government subsidy? In this case, the high risk of failure meant that private companies wouldn't invest at large-scale production until they knew whether their vaccine was going to work. That's really inefficient because time was of the essence, just as it is for climate, right? So we need to take some of that risk off the private companies and take that onto the social sector, have the government take some of that risk. And that's what that's what the UK and the US did. They took a lot of that risk off the private companies and got them to build capacity, increase capacity before they said, we will buy this vaccine, we will pay for your factory before we even, 6 months before we know whether this vaccine is going to work. And that means that the day you get regulatory approval, we will have lots of vaccine. And that was absolutely worth it because of, literally saving $1 trillion a month. It also allowed stockpile, and even if they had failed, it would have been worth the risk. What didn't work with COVID vaccines? the EU like negotiated long and hard to drive down the price, exactly the wrong direction you want to go in, right? You want to be paying more to get more, and delay is very costly. Purchasing once the vaccine was approved, again, that caused a lot of delays and a lot of, if you start the factory after approval, there's a lot of time spent like working on making it work better. Arguing over intellectual property rights, we can come back to that. That was really not the problem. That was not the issue. That wasn't really the market failure here. Investing in a national vaccine, that's what China did, put all their eggs in one basket of a national vaccine. It's not as good, you're screwed, right? Hence Shanghai being shut down. So what is all of that? What's some of the implications for that for climate innovation? Well, climate is again a situation where the social returns to innovation are completely different from the private returns, right? You've got huge, but all the benefits from innovation and mitigation will come to society as a whole and not to an individual person who, I've been working recently on innovation that will capture carbon out of the atmosphere and bury it into the ground. Like, that's not a product that anyone's going to buy. It benefits everybody in the world. So the market mechanism, the private return, is going to be much lower than the social return. There's also, all sorts of behavioral biases that people have about that get in the way of good innovation. And some things aren't patentable, so then you'll massively underinvest in innovation. And we got a huge scale of a problem. There's also a set of reasons why we underinvest in innovation in low and middle income countries. And so the overlap of climate issues that affect low and middle income countries get a double whammy, right? We massively invest in innovation for climate because of all the externalities. We massively underinvest in innovation for low and middle income countries because they're particularly prone to the problem that they can't pay the high prices while something is under patent, and some of, fear of expropriation. You invent, like the lesson from inventing HIV drugs and then having people, clamor and say you have to give them away for much lower prices is, unfortunately, pharmaceutical companies took the lesson from that they shouldn't be inventing something that's useful for low and middle income countries. Because you just have protests and people demanding that you give it for free. Like, why would I want to invent something that? So, this doesn't mean don't reward people who invent. It means break the difference, separate rewarding investors in innovation and what people pay at the end of the day. Right? You need the prices to be low and the product to be large, the production to be large, but that doesn't mean that the innovator doesn't get paid a lot. Right? You've got to separate these two things. What's one way to separate those two things is to use push funding, which pays for research. Sorry, push funding pays for research inputs. A way to solve some of the problems I've been talking about is to do pull innovation, pull rewards for innovation, which is to reward people if they come up with an innovation that's useful for society. So, patents do that, but they end up with the problem of monopoly pricing, which will often price out people in low and middle income countries. Another innovation, which I'm meant to be talking about, but I'm pretty much out of time, but is an advanced market commitment, which says, if you come up with an innovation, we will buy it, we donors or governments will buy it, and in return, you sell it at a low price. So we will pay you the difference, and we will reward you for your innovation, but only if you produce it at very big scale and sell it at low cost. And you don't have to decide who is the person you want to invest in. You just say, whoever invents this thing, we will buy it. And that mimics the market. So what's the advantage of an advanced market commitment? It leverages future spending. So it says, I would be willing to buy this thing. And in making that commitment, it produces an incentive to innovate now. It pushes people to do a low price and high quantity, which solves the monopoly pricing problem. You can build it so that you, as a donor, will only subsidize this thing if somebody actually wants to buy it. So there's this kind of market test. Does it work for consumers? But you're subsidizing it. So, you're paying for the innovation and the consumer is just paying the marginal cost of production. And, you can reward innovators and separate that reward from what the price is, right? So you're separating out the price that you're charging and what innovators get. And we have a good example of this. We did it for the pneumococcal vaccine, which has reached 150 million kids. Okay, I'm just going to end by saying we have thought about what kind of products this might be useful for in climate and come up with some examples where we think it could be very useful to have a climate AMCA commit to buy this product if people came up with it. And I'm just going to leave you with that list of examples because I've gone way over my time.
Around the early 2000s, before 2000, the traditional way of responding to humanitarian crises, say crop failure or a tsunami, was to provide aid in kind. For those of us who've lived in developing countries, we've seen the thing from the American people and the handshake on the bags and on the containers, canisters of oil. But over time, some countries began to notice that using aid in kind, giving people food, wasn't solving long-term problems because sometimes it was about food security and simply providing food to people didn't work. So they began to test an innovative way of responding to the problem, and that was cash transfers. Cash transfers were initially looked upon, if not with outright skepticism from the guardians of international development, with some suspicion about the efficacy and effectiveness of using that. But I think, and I could be wrong here, there was a certain amount of distrust of poor people. Like if you give poor people money, they're going to buy alcohol. They're going to do irresponsible things. So don't give poor people money. And that inherent distrust of poor people sort of drove that. But today, cash transfers are a significant piece in the suite of tools that we currently use in international development to such an extent that the one person who actually chronicles all of the new and innovative cash transfer programs in the world is some guy named Ugo Gentilini at the World Bank. The World Bank itself now has become a big proponent of cash transfers. The reason I'm telling this story is an innovative way of doing a development that is at first seen with skepticism that actually comes into the core and becomes a key tool of that. Which brings me to my third thread, which is AMCs. I'm going to try to tell the story of AMCs as, and hopefully not to make, not to cross any lines. My understanding of AMCs is 2004, Glennerster and Kremer do a paper recommending AMCs for malaria vaccine research. 2005, Kremer, Owen Barder, and Ruth Levine do a proposal for AMCs for the pneumococcal vaccine. And then it becomes a thing, and she showed it reached 150 million children, 700,000 lives were saved. And I think as recently as 2016, Kremer, Snyder, and Levine wrote a paper on the models for AMC. I hope I'm doing justice. Okay, great. to that. But when I was the Minister of Works in Liberia, which brings me to this piece that's supposed to tie them together. When I was Minister of Works in Liberia, um, we inherited a country with very few paved roads. And we're in the tropics, which means 6 months out of the year we have heavy rains, and 6 months out of the year it's really hot, and everything is dry. But during those 6 months, only 49% of the country, of the population of the country, lived within, say, 5 kilometers of an all-weather road. So it meant 51% of the country got poor every rainy season. And in 2010, there was a picture of 200 trucks stuck in the mud. Now, those trucks would remain stuck in the mud until the sun came out. So until the rainy season ended, those trucks will remain there. And this happened every single year. By then, I was Deputy Chief of Staff to President Sirleaf, the head of the President's Delivery Unit, and I began to think that there had to be another way to solve this problem. It's very expensive at the end of every rainy season to come back and try to repair gravel roads, because next rainy season, the exact same thing is going to happen. Over time, you have spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing the exact same thing. More importantly, it was environmentally unsustainable. So usually at the end of the rainy season and you have to repair the roads, you have to remove the unsuitable material and truck in new material for gravel. Over time, because you've done this year after year, the distance between where there's new material and where you have to do it becomes longer and longer, and you're not simply manufacturing new material. Eventually, that's not gonna work. So the way we've solved this problem over time is by sealing the road. We call it pavement. Since the day of the Babylonians, we've been using tar, asphalt to pave roads. And since the Babylonians around 600 BC, we haven't really made advances to that. I mean, literally, we're still using tar today. The only difference now, we also use Portland cement. But if you saw on her slide, cement is probably one of the most emissions intensive activity. Supposedly, if the cement industry were a country, it would be like the second or third largest emitter of emissions. So roads need to be paved in poor countries, Liberia included, but the means of paving roads have not changed since the days of the Babylonians. And now we have a mismatch. In the places where there's significant need for pavement, you don't have the research capabilities to introduce new materials to pave. And in the places where we have research capabilities to introduce new materials, where we have the best geotechnical engineers, materials engineers, road access and material, is not a problem. So there's no reason for people to invest in that. There's a misalignment here in incentives. Can we alter the incentives so people with the capacity to do the research can? Now, the question is, why is it important that we pave roads? Well, it's almost impossible to build a modern economy without an infrastructure spine. More than 90% of freight and passenger traffic in Africa occurs on roads. We need to build roads. But the way we're building the roads right now, using cement and asphalt, is really emissions intensive. So I'll give you this crazy example. From 1900 to 2001, or no, from 1901 to 2000, for a century, the US used about 4 billion tons, 4 gigatons, 4 billion tons of cement. So everything you see in the United States, the built environment, the roads, the Hoover Dam, the Empire State Building, Sears Tower, it's not called that anymore. Whatever, all of that stuff is 4 billion tons of cement. This is the built environment. This is what allows modern economies to work. In 3 years, from 2009 to 2012, China used 6 billion tons. So China used more than the US used in an entire century in 3 years to build the built environment as we see in China. Now, there are 2 places in the world where the built environment is still underdeveloped to such an extent it might need the same quantity: India and Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm focused on Sub-Saharan Africa. So the problem to solve here is, if we allow Sub-Saharan Africa to build the built environment using the same method that China did, the United States did, the emissions that's attached to that is significantly more than the world can bear. But we're not going to sacrifice the development of Africans simply because, hey, emissions, that was not a problem when you did it. So the suggestion we're making is, let us introduce new pavement materials that allow the poorest countries in the world to be able to pave their roads at significantly less emissions than was currently done before. So this is the problem that I'm trying to solve at the moment. So how? The way we're attempting to solve the problem is twofold. One is this mismatch between capabilities and need. So with a pull mechanism like a price challenge, we want to put up $50 million. Let's just throw numbers out there. It's not real money anyway. So a $50 million prize to whoever can introduce a novel material that meets 5 criteria. 1, it has to be cheaper than available options. 2, it has to be lower in its emissions use. 3, it should not require specialized training, like people should be able to use it. Thirdly, it should make use of marginal material, so you don't need special substances to be able to do it. I don't remember what the 5th one is. So we have a prize for that. And there are already things happening in the US that could lead to that. And I'll give you an example. One is at the Pacific PNNL. I don't know what that stands for, but the National Laboratory in Richland, Oregon. They produce a cement that is self-healing, which means if a crack develops in the cement, within 4 hours, it heals itself. Now, this is significant in places where maintenance culture is bad. When they developed the cement, they weren't thinking about Africa. They weren't thinking about the developing world. And I called them and said, hey, this would be awesome in places where maintenance is very expensive. At the Colorado School of Mines, there's a research on developing cementitious material that are 48% reduce emissions by about 48%, but is significantly stronger. Now, across the continent, we're seeing a significant rise in extreme weather events. So it means that the infrastructure we build has to be strong enough to withstand floods, wind. So the goal then is, one, offer a price challenge, but the second part is we need to create a market for this new product. Currently, in the poorest countries in the world, the largest financiers of infrastructure are the multilateral development banks. The second part of the project is to get the multilateral development banks to say, if you were to create a product, like Richard was saying, that meets all of these criteria, and the countries where you want to use it agree to use this product because it's able to meet this criteria, we will pay for it. Why is this necessary? This talk was supposed to be about what did we learn from Operation Warp Speed. I think after the pneumococcal vaccine, there was no real big push for using AMCs in international development until Operation Warp Speed. So what lessons did we learn from Operation Warp Speed? It reminds us that it is possible to take a novel practice like cash transfers, which people look at with skepticism, and eventually make that a central piece of the tools that are available for international development. So what Warp Speed teaches us is that we have an incredible tool that can be matched with the scale of the global public goods questions we have, whether it is with new cereals that can be grown in drought conditions in the Sahel that will prevent the herder farmer crisis across Niger and Nigeria, or is the introduction of new cereal that are introduced in places like Madagascar and Somalia that allow people to remain in those places and still be able to, but there is a mismatch. AMCs can get us there. Now, cash transfers are being used for many different things. Here in the US, we benefited from cash transfers, didn't we? We got our stimulus package, right? And so it is possible for us to take this because we've demonstrated the significant outcomes that come from applying novel ways of being able to solve the same problems that we faced for a long time. So my hope is over the next 2 years, this year we're trying to get where are we with the project? First, we're trying to create the target profile, the profile of the target product along using engineers, because I'm not an engineer, so that we can be able to determine the technical profile of that. And then next year, be able to raise the money for the price challenge, but also be able to get the multilateral development banks to offer to create the market for this new product. And one hopes that all of the things on Rachel's list will begin to get the kind of attention that we put into COVID. And my hope is that the lab here will be a big part of doing that. Thank you.
Let me start by just thanking both of you for sharing those incredible insights. And one of the things that I really like to hear are sort of the personal moments, understanding the pathways of how we reach insights or great opportunities. And so I would love to hear Rachel leading into the book. What was the generation? Where did these ideas come from? How did you and Michael sit down to write that particular work that got us to this moment today?
Okay, so there's how did I get involved in the book, and then there's how the original idea of kind of an AMC. And I should say, so both Michael and I would say, we're not the first people to come up with the idea of an advanced market commitment, but as for any idea, it's 0.5% inspiration, and most of it is about trying to apply it. Like, what you're going through now of like, how do we come up with the technical criteria? Who's going to pay for this? How much should it be? Like, that's the huge amount of, that's the vast majority of work on all of these things. There is a slightly funny anecdote. So how I got involved is I'd just given birth to our first son, and probably week 2, and Michael came in, and so I was on maternity leave, and Michael came in saying, "Oh, I'm in the middle of this book. You're not doing anything, are you?" So I rewrote the book on my maternity leave. Anyway, but I think the point, and like organized it. No, but I think the idea came from this basic fundamental problem that that innovation is underinvested in, and that in particular this problem that all the, as you were saying, like all the research money on transport is going in the rich world, and and developing new cement is going in the rich world, or actually where we need it, where the big gap is in the poor world, right? So in pharmaceuticals, huge amounts of money are going into developing new pharmaceuticals in the rich world, and all these diseases in the poor world that are just not getting any attention. And COVID is an example of how, like, if you ignore what's happening in the rest of the world, it comes back to bite us in the end. So and then the last part of it that kind of brought it all together is just this: everybody is just argues about patents and intellectual property. We saw the thing devolve into that in COVID too, and that's just a really unproductive argument. Like, you could have people have really strong views on either side, and the answer is neither to get rid of patents nor to say that patents are working fine. It's to break this link between what an inventor gets paid and the price that is paid. Because that's the basic problem of patents, is you reward the inventor by charging a high price, right? So it's neither that patents are evil, nor that in pharmaceutical companies are evil, nor that the current patent system works. It's to say these are two separate things: rewarding innovation and charging marginal product, and just separate those two things. So that's kind of the fundamental idea. But that, as I say, it was 1%, 0.5% inspiration, and a lot of it was what price should we charge, what target should there be, so lots of spreadsheets.
And at least one burn.
and at least
So, and similar question to you, I'd love to hear more about how it is that you personally, from your experience, then saw these particular opportunities and brought the two together.
So then I tried solving the problem when I was a minister. So I had an intern from Georgetown who was, no, before I even became minister, I had an intern from Georgetown who was there that summer here, but it was rainy season there. And I was saying, I was just talking aloud about the need to find a new way of being able to, she's like, oh, I used to date this guy who sold this product. And it worked really well in Ecuador, where it's also tropical. And I was like, well, can you put us in touch with him? And this was a chemical polymer that they mixed with the soil, and it changed the characteristic of the soil so that the soil behaved as if it were paved. It prevented the ingress of water, and it was dust repellent. So she was like, no, we had a bad breakup. I'm not getting in touch with him. I'm not getting in touch with him. And then so we looked it up, and then we found this product in South Africa that claimed to do that. And if you go on the internet today, you find a lot of it's called soil stabilizers. They make outrageous claims. None of them are actually true. So then we brought it to Liberia, and we tested one from here in the US. We tested the South African one, and the South African one kind of worked at the beginning of the rainy season. But then when the heavy rains started, it failed. So then came the idea that, hey, there is something out here. There is a baseline out here. Why can't we do more? And the inspiration actually is Norway. So, I mean, Norway is so rich now, no one remembers when they were poor. But in the 1950s, Norway wasn't as rich as it is today. And half of the roads in Norway were gravel. So it meant every spring when the snow thawed, half of the country was inaccessible because of the gravel roads. So in 1963, the Norwegian government commissioned the Norwegian Road Research Laboratory to come up with a new way of paving roads that wasn't any more expensive than maintaining gravel roads, that used local material, like blah, 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 blah. And the Norwegian scientists worked for 2 years, 63 to 65. And in 65, they came up with a new seal. Seal is just the thing, yeah. A new seal called the Otta seal, OTTA. But the Otta was just named for the valley where they ran the test. It was the Otta Valley. So then I thought to myself, if Norwegian engineers by themselves in 1965 could come up with a new way, imagine if you crowdsourced and invited engineers from all over the world to compete. We can definitely do better than the Norwegians. And so thus was this idea of being able to use, but then how? And that's when this idea of an advanced market commitment, or sort of like some pull mechanism, made sense for this thing that I was trying to do.
Oh, that's excellent. And I liked how you pointed out at one point, $50 billion. I mean, it's not real money at this point. And you also had a similar kind of anecdote of like, well, what about with $1 billion? Can you fix this? And I'm really interested if you guys could kind of talk a little bit more about this experience that we as humans are, I don't think well suited to think about the kinds of numbers that are possible. And especially if we're going to separate the potential returns for innovation and the actual price mechanism that we see as so key to allocating resources, that somehow there's this fundamental failing that we as humans have to be able to accomplish that. And I don't know if you've had any tricks or effective ways of communicating to help people understand these large numbers that we're thinking about or wrestling with.
I mean, so just on the COVID example, there's a huge amount of complicated modeling behind some of the work we did in COVID. But I think possibly the most valuable thing that I've done when we did, and possibly I have done in my life, is simply take the IMF figure for how much we were losing per month to COVID and said, that means bringing forward a vaccine by 1 month is worth at least $500 billion. And so basically just taking a very simple number and convey per month, and you saw the warp speed one of 12 hours, somehow if you take a big number and then split it down to a small time,
Yeah.
and then it's a number that is big enough, and then people can see that the time is small enough, like you could just see people's eyes light up. And I honestly think that's probably, that math of just dividing the IMF number by 12 is probably the most important thing I've done. Because, you know, we went around policymakers in the US and the UK and said, you've got to be like massively increasing the amount of money you're spending on COVID vaccines. And I think putting it as per month was
Yeah.
a big part of what persuaded them.
I don't have a really cool number on math. I think that what I have found to be really successful in selling my idea, because so I had met the current transport secretary before he became famous, like just like 2 weeks before he blew up when he was running his campaign, because he was mayor of South Bend and he was always talking about roads and potholes. And I was always talking about infrastructure. So we had a mutual friend who was like, you guys should talk. You talk about roads all the time. So I emailed him about this idea. So currently we have engineers from the transport department working with us on this. But so what did I use? What do I think? It's fear. And what do I mean by fear? Over the last 2 decades, China has lent over $153 billion to African countries. About 60% of that money has gone into infrastructure, most of it into transport infrastructure. Actually, the amount of money that's gone, the percentage that's gone into infrastructure is much higher if you remove Angola from the number of African countries. And so if you notice anything about the US State Department or the Department of Defense, one of the things that they're afraid of is this great power competition and the rising influence of China in Africa. So my thing is, do you want to blunt the rising influence of China in Africa? Like, imagine if the solution to the road problem across the continent came from an American university. That makes sense, right? So that is significantly cheaper than anything else they've actually thought about. So, and why did I think like the fear thing would work? I mean, most times when you talk to people about, you know, we have a big development problem, some person, to sound really sophisticated, would say, we need a Marshall Plan for that, right? Like the Marshall Plan is like something people throw around. But part of the reason the Marshall Plan worked was because of the fear in the US that in 12 to 18 months, there was going to be a collapse in demand for American exports. And so the US needed to do something to show up the European market. That fear helped drive the Marshall Plan. And so I think, you know, it's really terrible that I have to use fear, but it appears like fear of another gaining influence where you wouldn't might be something that might spur a big actor like the US, at least in my case. Yeah.
I think at that, I want to thank Rachel and Gyude for an incredible start to a conversation together here on campus. I don't think I fully recognize that Gyude's teaching right now at Harris, and we also need to thank Harris School of Public Policy for helping co-sponsor this week and helping host so many of these great events, and frankly, for being the home to policy conversations on our campus. And so for all of that and for your contributions, and please join us in the reception to keep the conversation going. Thank you so very much.